Hi, Brian.
Ryan, are you excited to teach something besides Mod 2?
Yeah. Yeah, I was on Mod 2 for about a year, so it's definitely time for a shift. I was excited about going to Mod 1, but Mod 3 is also, yeah. I mean, Mod 3, y'all can just do more.
For sure.
I was pretty stoked that you we're gonna be in Mod 3, Brian.
Thank you. I'm glad to see all of you. Glad to be here again. And also, I've taught everyone in this mod. It's not just the people I've had last mod. Taya, I think that was my first time teaching Mod 2, actually, Taya. So that's funny. Like Taya, I started Mod 2 and there's like a year, and then all you other folks, it's the end of my time.
It's been a while. I have a tiny baby now.
Yeah, congratulations.
Turing not being pregnant is way better than Turing being pregnant,
Glad
for
to
the
hear that.
record, if anybody asks about that in the future.
Is it a little boy or girl?
Little girl, her name is Melia.
Amelia, that's very pretty.
Yeah, she's 7 months old now. She likes to scream when I'm in class. No, she's generally a pretty good kid. I think she's confused about why I'm not constantly around now. I feel like every time I had you in Mod 2, there was a cleaning supplies on that table.
There still were up until yesterday. It's like new mod. I gotta clean something before I start.
Start off fresh. Now it's really quiet. Turned off the music. Let's see. Get some audio.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off here. Great to be with you all again. Great to be back in my back in 2103 with you all. Not expected, a little bit of a last minute change, but I'm really happy to be with you all again. I've taught everybody in this mod at some point. So yeah, looking forward to it. The one thing that I'll mention about that is I was out on Monday and just kind of like getting back into the swing of things on Tuesday. So there might be a couple things where I'm still like trying to get caught up, or maybe you have some context that I'm not aware of. So I just ask for a little bit of patience. And if you do notice something that like maybe I'm not aware of, that maybe like you went over, or I'm like repeating myself, please just like feel free to kind of let me know. And you can also like Slack me offline if there's anything you think is important. As far as like housekeeping things, Megan and I were talking yesterday about scheduling one-on-ones, and we decided to do the Once Hub thing again in this mod. So if you were with me and Jameson last mod, we used Once Hub for a lot of our scheduling, and we're gonna try and do something similar this mod, at least for the one-on-ones. Be on the lookout for that. Meg did send out a sign up sheet earlier through Google Docs. So if you already signed up on that sheet, we'll keep your same time slot. But for the rest of you folks, we'll get that set up today and send out some links probably this afternoon. Yeah. And I think that's everything that I had for housekeeping. So let's get into sessions and cookies. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of like server side, client side, front end, back end. So I'm going to give you all, I'll give you all a couple minutes to think through these questions, and then I'll put you into some breakout rooms. So if you want to just think to yourself for about a minute or two here, or break out a notebook before I send you off to talk about it with some of your peers. I'll go ahead and drop these questions in the chat too, so you have access. All right, I've got some breakout rooms open, so go ahead and move into your room. We'll have 5 minutes.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, Con. How you
Good to
doing?
see you again.
Same. Con, do you go by Joe?
No, it's a terrible and not very funny joke.
Wait. Got it.
Because there's
Joke
so many
on, joke on
Joes.
him.
There's so many Joes in this class, and I wanted to be a part of the Joes.
Oh, got it. Okay. When I say it fast, it sounds like joke on him. Joke on him.
More like jokes on you, Brian.
Yep. Yeah, you got me. All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and talk about this together. Can I get some volunteers to answer any of these three questions? Just kind of leave it open. Taya?
Server versus client stuff. I think client side is like survey. They're clearly not awake yet. Saving stuff on their browser or their device, like cookies, for instance. My favorite cookie is a snickerdoodle.
Nice. Saving on the user's device. Yeah. Great, thank you. Lee.
I would say chocolate chip walnut cookie is my favorite. Also, Jen added in the oatmeal to hers, and like I've got to steal that chocolate chip walnut oatmeal, but that is fully from Jen. We had talked a little bit around like server side, client side, and the server side utilizing sessions. Again, this is from Jen. She really did a great job. And then the client side utilizing cookies.
So I could say like storing on the client side, or how about creating cookies is an example of storing on the client side. Yeah. So another way to say that cookies are stored client side. And if that, part of what we're trying to do right here is to really try and distinguish what that means. Like, what does it mean for something to be client side versus server side? I think this is one of those terms that people throw around like, oh yeah, it's stored client side. But if you've only been programming for like 6 months, that might not actually mean anything to you. So yeah, the cookies are stored client side. Server side utilizes sessions. I'm actually going to say, I'm going to edit this a little bit and say sessions can be stored client or server side. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So yes, they can be stored server side, but they could also be stored client side. Great. Can I hear from some other folks? We'll go for the second question there. Lawrence.
Feel like the difference between front end and back end is whether or not it interacts directly with the database.
And which one interacts directly with the database?
The back end code. And then it passes packaged information to the front end for consumption by the user. No.
Can you say that last part one more time?
It packages the information from the database, and then the front end presents it to the user.
Yeah. Noah.
Would it be appropriate to refer to a session as a kind of cookie?
Yeah, yes. I will I think I think I have a point on that a little bit later. So I'll just hold on to that. But yes, think this idea of sessions and cookies very much related. I would say that cookies are what we use to make sessions work. Yeah. Taya. Or was that from before?
No, I was just gonna say maybe a succinct way of putting it could be that the front end consumes the back end and the client consumes the front end, uses.
Yeah, let's say sorry, can you say that one more time?
So in my head, it was like a little pipeline, and you have the client and they're consuming the content of the front end, and the front end is consuming the content that the back end produces, and the back end interacts with the database.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think I would say I would say the client more is the front end. So the client, if you think of the client as like the web browser, like Google Chrome, for example, that is the front end, and that's kind of where things are happening. I don't want to get too far.
No,
ahead of myself.
that helped clarify in my brain what I was saying.
Good. Alex.
Mine is a very dated question, and I'm curious as to if a front end cookie might be something like, remember you could have your top friends on MySpace? Maybe. Is that like a front end cookie where like it tracks like the styling or like the data that's displayed, but doesn't, I don't know. Is that an example of a cookie, or is that just some database thing that I don't understand? But, yeah.
So I will say that when you say like front end cookie, all cookies you can think of as front end. They are that's kind of to this point. Yeah, right there. Of cookies are stored on the client. So maybe this will help a little bit. If I'm just like connecting these words together, I will very much say front end equals the client. When we're talking about the front end, we're talking about we'll say client side. So things are happening on the client, the browser. So I'll put in quotes here or parentheses browser. And then if things are happening on the back end, this is happening server side. Caleb, I saw you had a hand up. Was that your point?
I was going to say front end is client side and back end is server side. And I promise I was going to say it before you typed that out. So
Sure you were. Yeah. 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 And did that help clear things up, Alex? A little bit? I think that was Alex.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me ask you all this. So I think this is like one last point that I want to make. So every time our code is executing, when we write code for it to be run, when the code is running, it needs to take up some sort of computer resources. Without getting into too much detail, there needs to be some sort of like CPU, some sort of processor that's going to actually like do the things we want to do. So if we have written code to say 2 + 2 = 4, there needs to be some sort of hardware that actually makes that calculation for us. So if we're talking about the back end, what's the like physical machine that is doing that is processing that? Lawrence?
A server in somebody's closet.
So backend code uses resources of a server. So you can think of this as like, if we were actually in the basement, I'd be able to like take you all the Turing basement to the server stack that we have. They're like physical computers in a closet in the staff area. And so you could say like a dumb machine sitting in someone's closet. You can also think of this as, some remote Heroku server running somewhere, somewhere out there, there's like this Heroku thing. We don't know exactly where it is, but the point is it's not like on our computer. What about the front end? What resources does the front end code use? Taya?
Is that whatever the client's computer is, or if I'm looking at something on my phone or?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just change that to a user's computer. Because when we hear client, think like the web browser. That's the thing. Yeah, that's the client. So if when you say like client's computer, I would say it's more like the computer that the client is running on. So if I open up Google Chrome on my computer, when I visit a website, all the front end code that they're delivering to me, that's running on my computer, my physical machine. And I think that idea like might seem kind of odd. So like as we're writing web applications, we're actually telling other people's computers what to do. And that seems kind of dangerous, right? That like if I go to a website and they give me a bunch of code to run, well, if there's a like malicious code on there, that like seems like it could be dangerous if I'm just like taking code from the web and running it on my computer. Can I think this will be my last question here. Can I get some examples of like what we've maybe hopefully we've had a chance to dabble in some of these technologies, but maybe not. What technologies would be considered front end and which ones would be considered back end? And let's try and stick with ones we've used before or talked about. Ty, I'm going to put you on pause here. Can I hear from somebody else? Alex.
Isn't CSS front end?
There you go. Yeah. So CSS is an example. Whether or not it's like code is debatable, but yeah, that's a great example. Can we spitball some others? Molly.
Yeah, so like JavaScript and frameworks that use it, like whatever, Bootstrap or other thing, the tools we've used to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of like JavaScript frameworks, but just to keep it more general, JavaScript, very much a front end. At least in our context, we've been using it as front end. Now you can use JavaScript on the back end. We won't get into that. And so what's an example of backend technologies that you all have used? What code executes on the backend? Very, very important. Alex?
Ruby?
Yeah, 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 your Ruby. Your Ruby is your backend code. So Ruby running on the backend on some remote server. And if our app gives some JavaScript back as a response, we talked about HTML, CSS. Let's also throw HTML in here. So far in our apps, we've really just been doing HTML and CSS, but we could also, and I think some of you have gotten into this, we could also send back JavaScript. So essentially, when we have a JavaScript response, we're telling the client's computer what to do. We're telling them what to do rather than executing that on our server. So that's kind of like the difference between server side and client side. I want to try and drive this home with a diagram. Let me open up my whiteboard here. And so I'm going to draw the this like client server request response cycle. I'll draw it really fast, kind of like I've drawn it before. So go like this, and then, yeah, let's do this. So this is a server, and let's say this is where our, let's say Ruby on Rails here. I've said Rails before, but let's be more specific. This is where our Ruby code is running. And so we're gonna have a client, which is some sort of like web browser, like Google Chrome. So someone wants to use our app, they're gonna send that HTTP request to say, hey, I want something. And then our app is going to send back an HTTP response. And a lot of times our app needs to access our database. So I'll draw that like this, and I'm purposely drawing it separate from the server. It's more of like the database is separate and they interact together, not so much that the database is part of the app running on this server. So just to summarize what I've got here, client wants to visit our website. They send an HTTP request. Our server receives that HTTP request, goes through routes, controllers, MVC, all that, probably needs to hit the database a lot of times, and then sends back a response, and that's what the client will see. Any questions about what I've got so far? So when we're talking about this server side, client side thing, the thing that's really important to add into this diagram now is we want to add in multiple clients. So this is something that we haven't necessarily seen before, but we need to start considering the fact that there are a lot of people who want to use our web applications. Well, hopefully there's a lot of people who want to use them. So it's not just like there's one client. There are all of these clients. So Joe A's web browser, Joe B's web browser, Joe C's web browser. They all have their own individual interactions with this server. Lee.
So with that, we call the client the web browser, but is that, we're also referring to like the human behind the web browser as well, in essence?
Yeah, and that's who we're talking about when we say the user. So the user is the person using their web browser.
Thanks.
So when we're talking about storing something client side, you'll see in this diagram, there's really only one place to store that, and that's, well, I don't know if one is entirely accurate, but I'll kind of draw it like this. Like if we're storing something server side, there's this one place to store it. There's this central location, and we're not going to get into like complex deployment where we have multiple servers and they're all time. We're not going to get into that. We're just thinking very simple. One server, one database. This is where we're storing our information. So storing things on server side has this implication of every single client doesn't really have unique access to it. So when this client wants to access something from the database, it's the same database that this client is accessing as well. So that's storing something server side. If we store something client side, each client is going to have a unique storage for that. And so this is where I'll start to like, we already mentioned this, cookies are stored client side. So if we're talking about storing something in the client, I'm just going to draw really simple here, a little cookie. So if we want to make a cookie, this client gets its own cookie. So then if we have another client that accesses our website, they get their own little cookie here. And then this client accesses it, they have their own unique cookie. And so this is really important here, or really useful, that when we are setting these cookies, when we're making this client side storage, each client has their own unique copy of it. And copy is not really the right word because it's not a copy of all the other, like this cookie over here is not the same as this cookie over here. They all have their own unique storage space, and they can't access someone else's storage space. So that is very important. Joe, R.
Yeah, so when the cookies are actually created, like just to confirm, I guess, they're created as a set cookie with the server, correct? So like the first request from a client to the server, it doesn't actually have a cookie. It gets created first as a set cookie from the server, and then in the response, and then like the next request, that's when it has that cookie, or like how does that work?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, you've got it. If that doesn't make sense to everybody right now, that's okay. But yes, technically it's going to be sent through the HTTP headers as a set cookie header. And so that's how that will work. Yeah, let's actually do that. Let's go through that. Let's draw one more client on here and go through this process. So somebody, let's say this is actually, one second here. Okay, so this is a new client here. This is a person visiting our website for the first time. The first time they visit it, they are not going to have any cookies from us. We haven't stored anything on their browser yet because this is the first time we've interacted with them. So the client without a cookie will send a request, and our app at the appropriate time, maybe not with every request, but when it's ready, our app is going to send back a response. And in that response, there is going to be there's going to be this cookie. I'll just draw it like this. And it goes over to the client. And so our server is sending that cookie over to the client. And so you can imagine it kind of like goes down this response line here. And that's how it actually gets stored on their browser like this. The next time after they have that cookie, the next time they want to visit our website or they send a request to our website, they send that cookie along with the request. Molly?
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering if there are like limitations on that storage, because like what's stopping us from storing like a bunch of stuff on someone like unused, like other people's computers, I guess. Like it seems like we're worried about database storage on like a large scale in like app databases. So like, yeah, like are there like limitations on that, or like how, yeah.
Yes, there are limitations because you're right. If it was just my website can do whatever it wants to your computer, that would not be good. So there are limitations. We'll get into a couple of those. Natia?
I don't know if you know this, but just out of curiosity, I think it was like a year or two, all of a sudden every website started asking you if you could have cookies. And like before that, they didn't. And like what happened and why?
Correct. I've got a couple of videos that I'm going to link to you at the end here. One of them is more recent and it will talk about that. I believe it was, I think it was a like European organization that like created some sort of like international law around that. But yes, there was something that happened where websites all of a sudden now start to have to say, do you accept this cookie first? Let's go ahead and take a palm here. Mark, I saw your hand go up. If you have a question, we'll get to it when we come back. We'll go a little bit longer here. Let's come back at 9:40. So come back at 9:40. All right, and as you come back, can you, if you all could turn on your videos or give me a reaction or something, just to let me know you're back. That would be great. Cool. So I think there was a couple hands that came up at the end. I'm going to go through a couple slides here, and that will kind of like be all the content that I have. Just to like, before I get into this, I want to make the connection back to what you all did yesterday. What we're doing here really is we've already kind of like solved this problem in code that I'm about to talk about, which is HTTP statelessness. We've already solved this problem. We've already written the code. And now we're kind of like circling back to, well, how does that work under the hood? So HTTP statelessness. So in mod 2, at the very, very beginning, we talked about this idea of, or use this analogy that the HTTP request response cycle is like two pen pals exchanging letters through the postal system. So we had the sender is the client. So someone sends a letter, they're the client. The receiver is the server, the person receiving the message. The postal system is the internet. The postal system delivers the message. The HTTP request travels through the internet to get to the server. And then HTTP is our common language that we use to communicate. So it's like English or Spanish or whatever language you might write that letter in. We need some sort of like common standard way to communicate so that we can understand each other. Now, one key difference that this does not, this analogy doesn't really cover is this idea that HTTP is stateless. So what this means when we say HTTP stateless, what we mean is that every request and response doesn't inherently know about the previous requests and responses. So if you're in the pen pal analogy, if I write to my pen pal and say like, hey, I'd really like to buy a boat. And then I send them another letter and say, hey, I got in contact with a dealer, the price is $1,000. That pen pal might remember, oh yeah, they're talking about a boat. Even if I didn't say anything in my second letter about I want to buy a boat, if I just say, I found a dealer, it costs $1,000, they might infer, oh, based on this previous message that I received, this person, they're talking about buying a boat. Just an example there. HTTP, we don't have any notion of remembering the previous request. So if we're going to try and like modify this analogy a little bit, it's like your pen pal has a very, very short memory. And every time you throw away, every time they read a letter, they just throw it away. So they get your letter, they're like, oh, cool, this person wants to buy a boat. And then they throw it out and they just totally forget about it. And then the next time I send them a message, I say, I found a dealer, it costs $1,000. They might say, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't remember the last thing we talked about. I threw away that letter. It's out of my memory. So this is a problem. HTTP is stateless. And we want to remember our users. Oh, I want my animations. One sec. Animate these slides. Okay, so this is a problem because good user interfaces remember users after they log in. So you don't need to send, in a good website, you don't need to send your username and password every time you do something. That would be so frustrating if I'm on Amazon and I say, I want to add a shopping cart and here's my username and password so that you know that I have permission to add this to my shopping cart. And then I want to change the quantity and here's my username and password. And I want to add another user. Here's my username and password. That would be a very frustrating user experience. So a good website remembers you after you've logged in. Lee?
I think that my question is not necessarily relevant, and I think I'm going too deep into the pen pal analogy with it. So I'm going to go ahead and just skip it for right now. But thank you.
Sure. Hold on to it for now. Okay, so here's the problem. We want to remember our users, but as we just said, HTTP is stateless. So if every HTTP request response doesn't remember about the previous ones, we can't really remember our users. So this is the problem. This is a problem. And the answer is cookies. And this is the answer to most questions in life. As we talked about earlier, this allows apps to store data client side. So picture that diagram again. We're storing this cookie on the user's browser. We're not storing it in our database. And as we mentioned earlier, the really important thing about client side is that every client, every web browser has their own unique set of cookies. So every browser can uniquely identify itself with its cookie. So whenever a client makes a request, they're going to send that cookie along with it. So our server sets the cookie, the client just automatically sends that cookie along. So going back to that pen pal analogy, this is, so our pen pal has this really short memory. They're throwing away our letters every time they read them. So what we could do is every time we mail them a letter, we also send along a picture of ourselves to remind them who we are, something like that. So there's this additional piece of information that we need to send along to remember previous interactions. Mark?
So when you clear out your cookies or your history or whatever, is that like, does that mean that you're like a new client once you visit the site that you visited before?
It probably means that the site, from their perspective, yes, you're not necessarily a new client, but you're an anonymous client. You're just someone who they don't know who you are. Maybe you would call that a guest, someone who hasn't logged in. So cookies are really helping us remember who has logged in. Not necessarily everything that they've done, but just who they are.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Joe?
Yeah, you said that each client has their own unique cookie. What makes it unique? Is it just like a domain name attached to each cookie that makes it unique to that client, or is it something else?
It's the pure fact that it's stored on the client. So just the fact that it is stored on my computer, for example, if you and I, Joe, both go to facebook.com and facebook.com sets cookies for each of us, my cookie is stored on my computer, your cookie is stored on your computer. So that's all I mean when I say they're unique. They're just like separate entities versus there's not one global cookie that everybody has access to. Does that clear up?
Gotcha. Yeah, and just one more real quick. So sessions are stored inside of cookies, is that correct? And that's the last question.
Yeah, I would say sessions are stored inside of cookies in Rails. Yeah. That's going a little farther ahead, but that's okay. Aaliyah.
So we're talking about cookies storing like primarily like login information or like identifying information so that on the server side, we know which user we're talking to. Will we get into, and is it common to store any other kind of information in that cookie?
Yeah, so some other examples of things you can store in cookies, very common are like site preferences. So if I go to a website and I want it to be like a certain style, like sites have dark mode, for example, that would be a good example of something to store in a cookie. A shopping cart is another thing that's commonly stored in cookies. So like keep track of all the things that you have in your cart. Yeah, I would say those are two good examples.
Got it. So it's kind of like some information that is maybe too short term to be worth storing in your database, but you want to know for this particular like time that that your user is interacting with your site would be something that might make sense to keep in a cookie.
Yeah, that's a good distinction between the database because we can store for login information that's not something we can necessarily store in the database, but something like a shopping cart that you can kind of imagine how that would work. We have a user, then we have a cart that belongs to a user, and that cart has many items. We could totally make that database interaction happen. The trade-off is if it, as you said, if it's short-term data, would we be kind of like, would we be using something that's maybe overkill would probably be the word. A lot of times using the database for storing something short-term would be overkill. Jen.
You're gonna have to bear with me on how to ask this. With like remember me and the saving username and passwords, like when you see that option come up on a site, that is essentially exactly what we're talking about, right? Okay, so what is, I guess, can you explain the difference between that and like when we see a message that says allow cookies? Is it just like presentation or it's specifying certain cookies? I don't know if I asked that right. I'm sorry.
So when you see that banner that's like this website uses cookies, accept cookies, that's just giving them permission to set the cookies. And then when you use something like remember me, or there are different ways to implement that, but the easiest way would be through cookies. When you do something like a remember me checkbox, then that's setting a specific cookie. So first you have to accept cookies. And then once you've accepted the cookies, then the app will try and store cookies.
So a quick follow-up to that, like when I'm on, I think it's Chrome, almost every site I go to, it says like save login, save password. Is that just like a mega cookie, like the biggest cookie you've ever seen that's just saving all of the, maybe a crumble cookie you could say, because those are pretty big, but is that just a big cookie?
Not exactly. That is more of your, your browser saving your like username and password. Not exactly the same thing. And I don't know enough to like really get into it, but.
Well, you know more than me, so that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I like the idea of thinking of it like a giant cookie. That might be for other reasons. Let's go to Joanna.
So if you're on your browser and you're using incognito mode, is that just like blocking the cookies?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep. Caleb.
So this may be touched upon in the videos that you're going to post, but in the event that we block cookies, do we use sessions instead, or are we just like, no, these are muffins, these aren't cookies, or what's the process there?
So are you saying like if you're using the internet and you every time it says accept cookies, you click deny?
Yeah.
So your user experience wouldn't be great. So looking at this slide here, cookies are how websites remember you. So if you just don't ever accept any cookies, you're keeping your information more secure. You're keeping, you're achieving more privacy, but then your user experience kind of sucks if you can't be logged in anywhere. So yeah. So I think that's a common question of like, why do we allow this to happen? Why do we share so much of our data? And this is kind of going beyond cookies. This is kind of just going into tech in general. Like, why do we give these companies so much data? Like, why do we let them know so much about us? And the trade-off is between privacy and user experience. Generally, if you give up some privacy, you will get better user experience. Jen?
Small question. Would this be how, if I'm window shopping online and I am good and choose not to buy it, and then I go to a completely different website and Express is like, hey, buy one, get one free. That's how? So they're
yes.
teaming up, kind of?
Yeah, they are teaming up. that starts to get into this idea of third-party cookies. So there's actually like different types of cookies. So some of them some of them cannot be shared with other websites. Some of them can be shared with other websites. Those like when it feels kind of eerie, like, oh, this website knows that I was looking at buying a boat. I'll use the buying a boat example again. That is a third-party cookie. I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Taya.
Just in my notes, I'm trying to write like what is stored on the cookie. So I've been calling it an authentication token because I made it up. What is a good thing to call how we actually identify? Is it just their user ID? Is it like something that's hashed? Is it like what is it?
Yeah, and this is where we can start to get into, no, I'm sharing the wrong thing. Let me redo my share real quick here. So this is where we start to get into like, how are we using cookies? And so I've got this code pulled up from what you all did yesterday. And if we look at, let's go to sessions controller, we can see what we're storing. And I'll kind of like, I will circle back to this, but we can see what we're storing is just their user ID.
And is that, that's just like plain, if you go look at that cookie, you can see the user ID. It's not like hidden in any way.
I'm actually going to do that for you. So I'll demo that. So let's hold off on that for a little bit. Lawrence.
Let me know if this is off track, but is there anything stopping us from, I mean, there's nothing stopping a website from storing all of our browsing data on their server if they want to know everything we've done. Cookies are just so cookies can just offload some of that from our server. Other than the authentication portion, it can be a way to save storage space for things like Caleb's talking about, specific themes or something like that. We could on our database say this guy likes this theme.
Yeah, and it feels like part of your question is like, why would we store something in a cookie versus like, we have this database, why do we just store it in the database? Is that fair?
I guess to some degree, I understand why we have to use authentication on a cookie because we have to have the authentication on their computer.
Yep.
But yeah, I guess some of that other stuff is, why is it in a cookie?
Yeah, there are advantages to cookies. Let me go through this next slide, and I think some of them will be on here. So this is just some like, yeah, let's go through this. So I don't need the animations for this one. So we've talked about authentication, but as you all have done a great job, giving us examples, you can store other things besides just authentication. So I want you to have in your mind, like, yes, cookies, very important and necessary for authentication. And we do other things with cookies. We're not going to get into too much of that in your time at Turing. We're not going to get too much into like, we're not going to give you user stories of like implement I don't know, you might in the next 2 mods, but I don't think you'll get a user story that's like implement a dark mode on your website that's stored in the cookies. Yeah, so you can use other things, but authentication is the most important thing. One of the downsides of cookies, the second bullet point here, is that they are very small. 4 kilobytes of storage, which is 4,000 bytes. You can think of a byte as like a single character. So like my name, Brian, would be 5 bytes of storage, for example. So in total, we can store 4,000 of those bytes per cookie. And I think there's also a max of 20 cookies per site, which is not a lot of storage. Yeah, that would not be enough to save like an image or a video or anything. This is really just like some plain text data. They are sent through your HTTP headers. So we talked about the HTTP anatomy last mod. I'm going to talk about it again tomorrow. but the headers are the mechanism that actually makes this work. So when a client sends a request, they are going to include a header called cookie, and it's just whatever cookie they have stored for that site. And then when the server wants to set a cookie in their response, they have this set cookie header. They are site specific. So if Facebook creates a cookie on my computer, that cookie does not automatically get sent to Reddit or ESPN or whatever website I'm using. We did talk about this idea of third-party cookies, which can be shared, but those are a different type of cookie. And so to circle back to Lawrence's point, a big reason you would store something in the client's cookies rather than the database is for efficiency. So every client has this 4 kilobytes of storage that we can utilize. If we use that rather than our database's storage space, we're kind of like optimizing the amount of storage space we need per user. So that's a big reason why you would store something client side. Yeah. Lee.
Kind of a silly question, but going back to when you talked about how small cookies are and how sites usually only have like a small amount of cookies that they give out, when you, or that's not how you said it, but when you were referencing that, did you mean like the client can only have 20 cookies for that website, or the website is only giving out 20 cookies? So after the 20th person like visits that site, then it starts over? That
it would be per 20 per client. So let me grab my whiteboard here again and just draw this again. What I'm saying is that there can actually be like multiple cookies in here, but there's 20 of those stored on this client, not 20 across all of those clients.
Okay, and that's like for that one site, not for the 20 sites that you visit. Okay, perfect. So each client only gets 1 case of cookies per site. Thank you.
Exactly. Oops, shared the wrong thing. Mark.
You might have said this, but I guess like you have like a bunch of servers out there and a bunch of clients. So then is like, you know, one server, if I'm the server, I can access everyone's, like a client's, all their cookies, and then see where they've been and all that stuff. Is that right? And then that's where like maybe third-party cookies come in or something?
So you said one thing in there. If I'm the server and I can read everyone's client, and I think you said I can see everything they've done. And that's not necessarily the case. We're not tracking every interaction this user has. We have to specify what we are storing. And we can't store an entire history of what the user has done because of this 4 kilobytes of storage limitation. There's only a certain amount that we can store. So if a user has been using our website for 20 years, there's no way we could store all of that information in 1 cookie.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Do you have any follow-up, Mark?
So I guess like a follow-up would be like, there's like some type of like deletion at some point of the history or something of those cookies. Is that right? Like something just kind of falls off or whatever after 4 kilobytes.
Yeah. So think of the cookies more of like they're like temporary storage. They're more of like short-term storage. Anything that needs to be stored for longer periods of time, that should be stored in the database. The database is much more permanent. I kind of wish I had a slide on here now of like, what's the difference between storing something in the database and the cookies? And yeah, a big difference would be the database is much more reliable, permanent. That's on our server. We as developers control that, versus the cookies are in the user's browser. And as some of you all have mentioned, you can just go clear your cookies. Like you could just go delete them all right now in 2 seconds. So they're very, very temporary.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. The next thing I want to do here is I want you all to watch this video. There's a some really good videos in here. I like this one. I think it really like goes into some of the technical details. So I'm gonna drop this for you all in, I'll put it in the chat. And then I'll also put in the chat, what do I want to say here? Let's say come back at 10:20. So I dropped the video and the time. So watch the video, take a palm, take a break, and then we'll come back at 10:20. Was I screen sharing this? Huh.
Yeah.
Well, y'all will get to see it again.
Don't worry, we didn't copy down your bank info.
Could you all hear the audio as I'm watching this video?
Nope.
Oh.
All right. So go ahead and turn on your videos again, or give me a reaction once you're back. Cool. I think I got most people here. Can I get a quick like thumbs up, thumbs down? Like, was that video helpful? Like medium? Just for like future reference. Yeah. Cool. Cool. Great. So what I want to do next here is I want to go back. I want to circle back to the code that you all wrote yesterday. So today's class has really been a lot of like background on like web technology. Cookies are essentially web. It's really a web technology. It's not a Rails specific technology. So this is like a lot of background information, but I want to make sure we tie it back into what we were talking or what we did in code yesterday. So what I've done is I just did like a project search here for session. And I found all of the sessions, the place where we had used that session hash, and I changed it to cookies. And the point of this is to illustrate what exactly we are storing in our cookies. So now rather than found user.authenticate, if they send us the correct username and password, then we set this cookie. We've just changed this to cookies rather than session. So if I go over to my my web browser here, I'm going to click log out. Oh, and that's not going to work. Okay, that's okay. Yeah, let me log in again here. So I've made a user called Brian. So I'm logged in here. Don't need to save this. And if I refresh, it still has this log out button. So this is demonstrating that it's remembering me. It's recognizing that someone is logged in and that they need to log out. So I'm going to keep hitting refresh here. You can see up in the little browser tab here, it's refreshing and it's continuing to remember me. So what I'm going to do next is open up these Chrome developer tools. And usually this is on the elements or the console tab up here in the top. You might not be able to see it, but you might have to click these arrows. But there's another tab up here called application. And under this, you can see storage, cookies, and then the domain here, which is localhost 3000.
Could you just say that one more time, how to find it? The whole thing.
Yeah, so in the Chrome developer tools, this top tab up here, you might not be able to see it if you're clicked on something else or if it's maybe like shorter like this, but you can click on these two little arrows here and you should see a tab for application. And under the application tab on this left pane, I see storage, cookies, and then localhost 3000 right here. Make sure you make this much bigger. And so what this is helping us visualize is it's helping us visualize exactly what is stored on the client, what data is stored on the client. The user ID and the value, which is that user's ID. So if you think back to that video that we just watched, this is my ID card. This is my who am I card. I'm visiting the website and I say, here's my card and it has my user ID. And so then in my server side code, I can say something like, if I go to the application controller, the current user is whatever user I can find with that user ID stored in the cookies. Lee?
I just want to make sure that I understand this user ID. Do you mind going back to that other page of code that you had? Oh, I apologize. In Atom. Yeah, thank you. So that found user.id, that's essentially taking the username and the password and giving that a unique ID so that's how the site remembers the user without storing the password.
Slight change. It's not that we're giving this user an ID. This user already has an ID. And so when they log in, we just take whatever ID they already have and store that in the cookies.
Okay. And is that ID specific to, like, is that like an IP address ID, or is that like, this is the ID for this website?
This is the ID for the user. So this is, if I open up a Rails console here, and I look at my users, user.all, it's this ID that's stored right here, like that.
Okay.
This is the automatically assigned ID that you're used to from Mod 2. Every table in our database gets this ID column for free. We're just using that ID column.
Okay, and so that ID is specific for that website.
For that user on the site.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. And so you can see this is user ID 1. That's where, if I go back to my browser, that's why this value is 1 here. So if I then delete this cookie, so if I double click, whoops, wrong thing there, sorry. If I double click and then delete this cookie, well, I've essentially logged out now. I've logged out my user because now that I don't have this cookie, this website has no way of knowing who I am. So that's as if in the Starbucks analogy, I took my ID card or my frequent user card and I just threw it in the trash. And then the next time I go to Starbucks and I'm like, here I am again, remember me, right? And they're like, no, we don't remember you. You didn't bring your card. You threw it away. So when I refresh, we'll now see that it says register or log in. Because I deleted that cookie. So now if I register another user, like let's register Brian 2. Oh, and I think I need to change this form. Yeah, I ran into this. I believe this is the local true option here. Sorry, one sec. If I register another user, and I refresh this page. Sorry, that didn't work. Let me do it one more time. Brian 3. Oh, sorry. I think. Oh, I don't think we made it so that it logs in on creation. Okay, I think I just need to log in now. There we go. Okay, so now that I've logged in with my third user, Brian 3, we can see now they're storing a different user ID here. Now they're storing a value of 3 for their user ID to uniquely identify that user. Taya?
Is there any security vulnerability associated with giving them the actual user ID?
Yes, exactly. So now because these cookies are stored client side, this would be really bad if we actually did it like this, because then I could just go in here and say, well, I'm actually user 2 now, and then refresh and watch. So right now it says welcome Brian 3. Actually, it's not going to change. Yeah, it's not going to change, but I've successfully told this application I am user 2. So going back to our Starbucks analogy from the video, this was as if my Starbucks card just had a name written on it, and then I erased it and wrote in a different name. And Starbucks said, well, you have this name, so that must be who you are. There's no sort of security. There's no, what I'll say, encryption around it. So this is the problem with just.
Sorry, what word did you just say? No, what around it?
Encryption.
Cool. I heard a different word.
Yeah, that's okay. So this is why plain cookies, this is why we can't use plain cookies to do this. This is why we use the session. So that's why rather than cookies here, we put session. So the key difference, yeah, I think this will be the last thing, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up here. We didn't get into like all of these different versions of signed cookies and encrypted cookies, and that's okay. I would say that's like nice to know information. I think the key takeaways from this class are that the HTTP is inherently stateless. Cookies are what we use to make it stateful. Let's make another slide here. So HTTP is inherently stateless, meaning we can't remember a thing about previous interactions. So cookies are what make HTTP stateful. Cookies are stored client side, so they're stored in the user's browser, which makes them unique to each user. So this is why we use them for authentication, because they can be unique to each user. And then what else do I want to say here? So let's talk about sessions very briefly. It came up earlier, and like, what is this idea of a session? A session in general is the idea of tracking what a user does on a site. And then cookies are the technology that make tracking sessions possible. So cookies, everything we've been talking about today with cookies is what makes this idea of tracking what a user does possible. That's what allows us to remember.
Are we going to go over sessions more at some point?
I'll do that right now, and then I'm also going to post some more resources for y'all. Yeah. So sessions in Rails. So this is where things get confusing, is session, the idea of a session in general, just the idea of tracking a user versus the session hash in Rails. Session in Rails is tracking a session. So session Rails is implementing this idea of a general session. And the way that that happens is with under the hood, it uses encrypted cookies. So what I just showed you all within localhost, where you can see the user ID, let me actually just go over to that real quick. This right here, where we can see the user's raw ID right here. This is not encrypted. The only reason I did this was so that we could visualize what is being stored. What the cookie actually looks like is right above here, this Congress tracker session. And we can see this whole like big, long, unintelligible string. This is in practice what it looks like. Of course, this is not very helpful because it's just a bunch of gibberish. But that's kind of the point. It is secure, it's gibberish. The user cannot change this, cannot manipulate it, and cannot read it.
So if we're exploring other languages, the session is essentially doing Rails magic in Rails or Ruby magic. And then in another language, we would have to do that by hand, or?
Maybe you might, if you were just writing an application in like raw Ruby, like you were doing everything from scratch, you would probably have to build in your own encryption mechanism in order to make this happen. This is kind of the problem with a lot of Rails things, is that it is like a lot of Rails magic. Just if I flip back over to the code here and look at what we wrote yesterday, just by accessing this session hash, this is storing a cookie and it's encrypting that cookie all for us just by putting something in the session. So there's some Rails magic that's going on under the hood, and everything that we've talked about today is kind of digging in deeper to how does this hash actually work.
So is session a method that we're calling? Or it's a hash?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah, it's a method that returns an object, and this object is a actually can we do a quick pry in here? What am I in? Session create. Let's do, and then this is going to have to be the last thing. Yep, go back here. I think I'm going to need to delete this cookie. I already have an account. We're in our pry now. If we just type in session, oops, wrong place. We're in this pry. If we just type in session here, we can see it's an action dispatch request session object. So this is some sort of Rails object that is smart enough to store sessions and cookies and encrypt them and all of that. What I want to leave you all with is just to kind of like zoom out and talk about like what is important here, what are our priorities. It is not important that you all really understand deeply how Rails sessions work and all of the like encryption and everything that happens under the hood with that. Really, what I want you to get out of this is essentially what was in that video. Sessions and cookies are a very fundamental web technology. They are sessions are the idea of tracking what a user does. Cookies are what makes it possible. Cookies are stored client side. That's really what I want you all to take away, because that will be important no matter what languages or technologies you work in. If you are curious, you can definitely dig deeper into how Rails sessions work, the encryption under the hood, the different options that you have. Rails sessions are stored in the video. The guy talked about the Rails sessions are actually stored client side. You could change configurations to make them stored server side. So there's a lot of complexity that comes with sessions and cookies. For right now, I want you to have more of a familiar understanding of them. All right, y'all, that is it. I've gone on over time here. I'm going to ask you all to very quickly go over to Meg's Zoom for the next class on authorization. So I'm going to wrap this up here. Thank you for your time.